There is one type of person that a guilt-tripping parent never challenges. Not the loudest child in the family. Not the one who screams back, slams doors, or storms out of the room. Not even the one who cuts contact and disappears entirely. No. The person a guilt-tripping parent is genuinely scared of is something far more specific, far more quiet, and far more psychologically loaded than most people ever realize. And once you understand who that person is, you will never look at your family dynamics the same way again. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong about guilt-tripping parents. We assume they're doing it from a place of power, that they're in control, calculated, dominant. But that's the performance. Underneath it, guilt-tripping is almost always a fear response. It's what happens when someone lacks the emotional tools to ask for what they need directly. They can't say, "I feel lonely." They can't say, "I need more from you." So instead, they architect a situation where you feel so responsible for their pain that you circle back on your own. Every guilt trip is, at its core, a disguised cry from someone who is terrified of being abandoned, dismissed, or powerless. And when you truly understand that, the entire dynamic flips. Because here's what that means. The person who frightens them is not the one who fights back. That actually feeds the cycle. When you argue with a guilt tripper, you're engaging with the performance. You're validating the structure they've built. You're proving that the tactic works. Because look, you're emotionally activated. That's exactly the reaction they've been trained to produce in you. But there's a certain kind of person who doesn't get activated, who doesn't take the bait, and that person short-circuits everything. Psychologists who study family systems and narcissistic or enmeshed parenting patterns have identified something they call the non-anxious presence. It's a person who can sit inside a highly charged emotional situation without absorbing the charge. They don't get pulled into the emotional undertow. They stay grounded. They stay warm but unshakable. And to a guilt-tripping parent, that groundedness is profoundly disorienting because it removes the feedback loop they depend on. No visible guilt, no frantic overcorrection, no pleading explanation, just steadiness. And steadiness, for someone who controls through emotional chaos, is terrifying. Now let's go deeper, because it's not just about staying calm. The person a guilt-tripping parent is truly scared of possesses something that goes beyond emotional regulation. It's a clear, unshakable sense of their own internal reality. In psychology, this is closely related to what's called a strong internal locus of control. These individuals know what they did and didn't do. They know what they are and aren't responsible for, and no amount of reframing, rewriting history, or weaponized tears will convince them otherwise. A guilt-tripping parent's most powerful tool is narrative distortion. They'll say things like, "After everything I sacrificed for you," or "I guess I'm just not important to you anymore." And the goal is to replace your version of events with theirs. But when someone has an unshakable inner compass, that tactic simply doesn't land. The rewrite doesn't stick. The guilt doesn't take root. And without guilt taking root, the whole mechanism collapses. Think about what happens physically when a guilt trip is deployed. There's a specific look, a specific tone, a specific sigh that gets carefully calibrated over decades. And in most children who grew up in that household, it triggers a very specific bodily response. The chest tightens. The stomach drops. The voice gets smaller. The apologies start forming before you've even had a chance to think. That response is conditioned. It was trained in you over years through emotional reinforcement and punishment. The person who scares the guilt-tripping parent is someone who has done the work to uncondition that response. Not through coldness, not through disconnection, but through deep, deliberate self-awareness. When the look comes and the body starts to react, they notice the reaction without being consumed by it. That gap between stimulus and response is where their power lives. But here's the part nobody talks about. The most disorienting thing for a guilt-tripping parent is not when their child stops feeling guilty. It's when their child stops needing their approval to feel okay. Because guilt trips don't just work through shame, they work through longing. The longing to be seen as good, as loving, as enough. When a child desperately wants their parent to say, "I'm proud of you, you didn't let me down," that desire becomes the hook. And every guilt trip is essentially someone pulling on that hook. The person who has genuinely released the need for that parental validation is no longer hookable. They can hear, "I thought you loved me," and feel compassion for the person saying it without crumbling under the weight of it. That's not indifference. That's freedom. And it is deeply unsettling to witness if you've spent your whole parenting life dependent on that hook. Now let's talk about something that makes this even more psychologically complex. Guilt-tripping parents are not all the same. Some are fully conscious of what they're doing. They know the levers and they pull them deliberately. But many, probably the majority, are completely unaware. They genuinely believe they're the victim in every story they've constructed. They have spent so many years inside their own narrative that they experience it as fact. These parents aren't lying to you. They're lying to themselves first. And that distinction matters enormously because it changes how you respond. A parent who is fully conscious of manipulation can potentially be confronted directly. But a parent who is unconscious of it will experience your confrontation as confirmation that you're cruel and they're unloved. You can't logic your way out of a reality that wasn't built with logic. This is why the person who unnerves a guilt-tripping parent most is not the confronter. It's the understander. The child who has done enough psychological work that they can look at their parent and think, "I see what's happening here and I understand why," without becoming responsible for fixing it. That combination, insight without resentment and compassion without obligation, is profoundly rare and profoundly powerful. It refuses to engage with the blame while also refusing to be swept away by anger. And for a parent who has relied on provoking either guilt or defensiveness, neither of those reactions showing up is genuinely destabilizing. Let's talk about boundaries, because this is where things get really specific. Guilt-tripping parents have a particular relationship with boundaries. When you state a boundary without any emotional charge behind it, they don't really know what to do with it. Usually, the first response is escalation. The tears get louder. The statements get more dramatic. "Fine, then I guess I'll just be alone. I never thought my own child would speak to me like this." That escalation is a test. It's checking whether you'll break under the pressure of increased emotional intensity. And most people do break. Not because they're weak, but because they care. And because caring was trained to look like surrendering. But the person who holds the boundary through the escalation, who says it again calmly and with love, but without wavering, that person represents something the parent has, rarely encountered. A wall that doesn't punish them, but also doesn't move. And once a guilt tripper realizes that emotional escalation isn't going to work on someone, they have a fundamental problem. Because escalation is the only tool in the advanced kit. Without it, they're left with direct communication. And direct communication is exactly what they've spent their entire lives avoiding. And here is the thing that almost nobody considers. The guilt-tripping dynamic doesn't just affect the child on the receiving end of it. It affects every relationship that child goes on to have. Because if you grew up being trained to feel responsible for your parents' emotional state, you carry that reflex into friendships, into romantic partnerships, into workplaces. You become someone who over-apologizes without knowing why. Someone who shrinks their own needs to manage someone else's discomfort. Someone who feels an inexplicable sense of guilt even when they've done nothing wrong. Therapists call this emotional parentification, and it's one of the most quietly damaging things a childhood can produce. The person who frightens a guilt-tripping parent has usually identified exactly this pattern in themselves. They've traced the reflex back to its origin. They've done the painstaking work of separating their emotions from their parents' emotions, and they've stopped carrying weight that was never theirs to carry in the first place. That unloading is visible, and it's threatening, because it says out loud without a single word that the original bargain is no longer in effect. There's also a timing dimension to this that most people overlook. Guilt trips are almost always deployed at moments of transition. When you're about to leave, when you've just achieved something, when you're excited about your own life going well. That timing is not random. Joy and momentum are threatening to a parent who uses guilt as a control mechanism, because your expanding life is implicit evidence that you don't need them as desperately as the dynamic requires. The person who scares them is someone who has noticed this pattern clearly enough that the timing no longer catches them off guard. They can feel the pull of the guilt trip landing right at the moment of their own success, recognize it for what it is, and not let it puncture the moment. That kind of pattern awareness is devastating to a system that runs on the element of emotional surprise. And then there's this. Perhaps the most quietly radical thing about the person a guilt-tripping parent is scared of is that they still show up. They don't disappear. They don't cut contact in bitterness. They call. They visit. They check in. But they do it from a different place. They do it freely, out of genuine care, not out of fear. And that shift, from fear-driven obligation to freely chosen connection, changes the entire texture of the relationship. A guilt-tripping parent can feel that shift, even if they can't name it. They can sense that the invisible leash is gone. And without the leash, the entire architecture of the dynamic has to change or fall apart. That is deeply uncomfortable for someone who has never learned any other way to hold on to love. What makes this even more fascinating is how that shift in the child actually creates an opportunity for the parent that they've never had before. When someone stops reacting with guilt and starts responding with clarity, it creates space for something genuine to emerge. Not always, not immediately, but the possibility exists in a way it never did when the cycle was running. Some parents, when they finally encounter a child who won't be moved by the usual tools, experience a kind of crisis that forces genuine self-reflection. The loss of the old dynamic, painful as it is for them, can be the very thing that opens a door toward actual connection. Not the performance of connection. Not the transactional closeness that guilt manufactures. Real closeness, built on honesty rather than obligation. And that is the bittersweet paradox at the heart of all of this. The thing that scares a guilt-tripping parent the most might also be the only thing that can genuinely save the relationship. Here's what this ultimately reveals about guilt-tripping as a mechanism. It's not actually about the other person at all. It's about the parent's own unprocessed terror. The terror of being left, of being forgotten, of mattering to no one. Every guilt trip, underneath all the theater of it, is a desperate and distorted attempt to answer the question, do you still love me? The person who scares them most is someone who can hear that question beneath all the noise and answer it honestly. Not perfectly, not unconditionally, but honestly. Someone who can say, I love you, and I am still my own person. That sentence right there, delivered calmly and meant completely, is the sentence a guilt-tripping parent has feared their entire life. Because it holds both things at once, connection and autonomy, love and limits, warmth and self-possession. And that is the person. Not the one who fights them, not the one who vanishes, the one who stays and remains entirely themselves. The one who cannot be shrunk, rewritten, or emotionally hijacked. The one who chose to understand rather than retaliate, and chose themselves rather than collapse. That is the person a guilt-tripping parent never quite knows what to do with. Because that person didn't break the relationship. They just changed the terms. And changed terms mean the parent, for maybe the first time in their life, has to grow. That's the psychology they're actually afraid of. Not anger, not distance. Growth. Someone else's quiet, steady, unshakable growth. And if you've recognized yourself in any part of this, either as the person learning to hold that ground or as someone still figuring out how to, then you already understand more than most people ever will about how love, fear, and control get tangled together in the place that's supposed to feel most like home. There is one more layer to this that deserves its own moment. Because we've been talking mostly about what this person does, how they stay calm, how they hold the boundary, how they stay connected without collapsing. But there's something equally important about what they don't do. They don't explain themselves into exhaustion. They don't write the long text message justifying every choice they made. They don't spend 40 minutes on the phone defending a decision that was theirs alone to make. And that restraint is one of the most psychologically sophisticated moves in this dynamic. Because over-explaining is what the guilt-tripping system runs on. When you explain, you're implicitly accepting the premise that your choices require justification. The person who refuses that simply says, "I've made my decision," and lets the silence hold. And that silence, to a guilt tripper, is louder than any argument. It's also worth naming the grief that comes with becoming this person. When you stop flinching at the look and shrinking at the tone, there is real grief in that. Part of what you're letting go of is the hope that if you just give enough, they will finally love you the way you always needed. Releasing that hope is a kind of mourning. The person a guilt-tripping parent is scared of has usually walked through that grief rather than around it. And instead of letting it harden into bitterness, they've let it soften into clarity. That clarity simply lives in the body of someone who stopped waiting to be saved by the very person who needed saving from themselves.